Good evening, and thank you for coming. I'd like to dedicate this talk to this year's senior class, to the class of 2026, in gratitude for making me better and braver, for inquiring into things I don't know. I've divided the talk into an introduction, 5 sections, and a conclusion. I will announce each segment as I get to it. There is a handout, although I think we're running low. If you got one, it has the longer quotes in the numerical order, and I will announce the number as I get to it. Introduction. Moral philosophy is a vexed field. It seems it is far easier to get one's moral values from one's God than to have to use human reason to work out a consistent justification for a system of moral principles. John Stuart Mill takes a swipe at moral philosophy in his treatise on utilitarianism. From the dawn of philosophy, Mill writes, the question concerning the foundation of morality has been regarded as the main problem in speculative thought, occupied the most gifted intellects, divided them into sects and schools, vigorously warring against one another. And after more than 2,000 years, the same discussions continue, end quote. Although I do not think that utilitarianism is a serious solution to the problem of the moral good, I can at least appreciate Mill's point. Tonight, we are going to look at Emmanuel Levinas' attempt to reframe the inquiry into the moral good by asking which areas of human life can give rise to genuine ethics. In the St. John's College program, we engage in serious study of 2 great moral philosophers, Aristotle, whose Nicomachean Ethics will soon be read in freshman seminar, and Immanuel Kant, whose groundwork for the metaphysics of morals will soon be read in junior seminar. Both Aristotle and Kant focus their inquiries on the moral agent. Aristotelian virtue ethics, as outlined in the Nicomachean Ethics, focuses on the development of good character. The goal is eudaimonia, happiness, or human thriving. Kantian deontological ethics, as outlined in the groundwork, focuses on identifying one's moral duty according to the yardstick of the categorical imperative, and fulfilling it regardless of circumstantial factors or consideration of possible outcomes. The 20th century Jewish philosopher and theologian Emmanuel Levinas offers a different premise for moral philosophy. Rather than placing the center of moral life in the quality of the agent or the action, Levinas shifts the focus toward our interaction with others. Levinas insists that the ethical domain does not begin until the agent leaves the domicile in which one tends to one's own needs and looks toward the needs of others. This is a shift away from the classical focus on the caliber of the agent or the action and toward a focus on one's interactions with other human beings. Let me give an example from Kant's groundwork to illustrate why I find the Levinasian approach satisfying. Kant uses an example of the guidance the categorical imperative would give when one might be tempted to steal food to feed one's starving family. The categorical imperative forbids this explicitly. The categorical imperative asks whether we could reasonably will that stealing food become universal law, and the answer is no. And yet this example gives one pause. Why is this man's family starving? The rational reassurance of having fulfilled one's moral duty seems like cold consolation for the one who has to watch her children starve. In today's world, we are faced daily with people, strangers, in our own community, much less around the world, facing poverty, homelessness, and hunger. The economic inequality of unfettered techno-capitalism enables the affluent to buffer themselves and avoid encounters with strangers. Regardless of one's religion, the moral conscience cries out for a philosophy that gives close attention to our responsibility for others. Levinas is unique in locating and limiting the domain of the ethical to a very particular type of encounter with others. Levinas distinguishes between the systems of totality, which allow individuals to remain anonymous, and the ethics of infinity, which calls us to an unmediated face-to-face encounter with the stranger, the widow, the poor, and the orphan. The ethics of infinity gives a profound moral imperative that I will argue cuts through the utilitarianism and isolation that defines our age. Levinas was a student of Martin Heide-gger and mastered Heidegger's philosophical method of phenomenology. Phenomenology is a descriptive, not prescriptive method. Phenomenology attempts to uncover dynamics or phenomena already at work in the human condition, but that remain unstated or overlooked due to their metaphysical complexity. Levinas does not attempt to deduce moral principles, but to tease out the ethical domain as he believes it to be already existing in human life. Section 1, the limitations of political justice. Levinas's pursuit of a philosophical ethics that could locate the good in individual human being was much influenced by the Holocaust, which he spent in a prison in Germany. After the war, Levinas attended the Nuremberg trials at a time when Jews were clamoring to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. In the Talmud lectures given in the 1950s, Levinas explores his sense that the crimes of the Holocaust were beyond the power of political judicial redress. Some crimes against humanity, Levinas thought, might be beyond the judicial system's attempt to find retributive or compensatory justice. Levinas understood that legal ethics are necessary, but found them insufficient as a ground for the full potential of human morality. Any ethical code that relies on a political system to enforce it can lose sight of its moral center. Its administrators become bureaucrats. The Nazi system that perpetrated the Holocaust against the Jewish people functioned like an assembly line. Individuals became cogs in an unjust and immoral machine. Levinas worried that the Nuremberg trials, with their clamor for justice, were not getting to the root of the problem of morality. The trials pitted the bureaucracy of the International Military Tribune against the bureaucracy that had enabled the Nazi regime. Levinas wants to ground ethics not on systems, but on the very essence of face-to-face human relations. In his talks on the Talmud, Levinas makes the radical suggestion that, quote, the laws of Nuremberg already contain the seeds of the horrors of the extermination camps, end quote. In Totality and Infinity, Levinas explores the existential and moral consequences of the possibility of, quote, to see without being seen, like Gyges, end quote. The ring of Gyges puts its bearer outside the collective moral life. Gyges can remain hidden from the gaze of others. He does not need to meet their gaze. This anonymity is possible in today's age. If reasonably affluent, individuals can live and do business without having to be seen. The ring of Gyges is an important symbol for Levinas. We encounter the ring of Gyges in Plato's Republic. Plato begins his inquiry into political justice with the myth of Gyges. In the myth, Gyges is a lowly shepherd in Lydia who finds a magic ring that can make him invisible. Using the ring, he enters the palace, seduces the queen, and with her help, murders the king and usurps the kingdom. The ring of invisibility is a token in moral philosophy for the possibility that there is no intrinsic virtue. Anyone, the claim goes, no matter how virtuous they might appear, would exploit the ring for personal gain if they had it. The ring of invisibility represents the lure of impunity. In the Republic, the story is used to illustrate the difficulty of determining whether there is any virtue for its own sake. Perhaps humans are essentially immoral, only held to good behavior by their fear of punishment. In the dialogue, Socrates and his interlocutors understand that if humans are only restrained from crimes by fear of punishment, there is no positive moral content to the virtues. Justice is a political virtue. It pertains to distribution, retribution, and compensation. As Aristotle points out in the Nicomachean Ethics, justice is not needed among friends. Friends, it is assumed, will work out any distributive or compensatory issues among themselves. Justice requires a judicial system. Western judicial systems attempt to find a balance between the rights and freedoms of the individual and the common good. The judicial system is often credited with attempting to achieve a moral good in the form of justice, but on its own, it cannot pass the test posed by the ring of invisibility. It administers justice from above. It has no mechanism to determine whether virtue exists for its own sake within the individuals under its jurisdiction. This is the question that Emmanuel Levinas takes up. Can we find within ourselves a moral good that does not rely on enforcement by a totalizing system? Is there such a source of the good within human beings? How can we understand and access such a source? In Totality and Infinity, Levinas explores the distinction between totalizing systems such as political judiciaries and infinity, the moral obligation posed to each of us by the existence of other human beings, all of whom have metabolic needs equivalent to our own. Excuse me. Levinas understands the importance of the inner life of the individual that is invisible to the public. The home is important. It enables not merely metabolic life, but a complex aesthetics that can unite the masculine and feminine, love and eros. But morality, Levinas thinks, begins only when we cross our own thresholds, and the threshold, too, becomes an important symbol for Levinas, and meet the gaze of others who are external to the private homes and spaces in which we retreat with the material goods we have procured and intend to consume. This eye-to-eye contact is with one who Levinas designates as the other with a capital O. To meet the gaze of the capital O other is to be willing to emerge from one's interiority and to engage in the fundamental welcoming posture of eye-to-eye contact. This crossing of a metaphorical threshold between one's interiority and the exteriority of the other is a necessary condition of awakening the moral conscience. The conscience, Levinas writes, welcomes the other, end quote. Section 2, the limitations of the doctrine of individual liberty. Levinas concludes that the moral conscience born of the eye-to-eye contact with the other is incompatible with the notion of individual liberty at the core of Western political and judicial systems. Levinas finds that these systems simply assume that individual liberty is a good. The value of individual freedom remains, quote unquote, undiscussed in Western philosophy. Levinas writes in the number one quote on the handout, political theory derives justice from the undiscussed value of spontaneity. Its problem is to ensure, by way of knowledge of the world, the most complete exercise of spontaneity by reconciling my freedom with the freedom of others. The assumption that individual freedom has moral value is a problem for Levinas. Does an individual's right to spontaneity have moral worth? This is a question political philosophy has not taken up. Levinas claims that in Western thought, the spontaneity of freedom is not called into question. Sorry, that was a quote. On the contrary, quote, its limitation alone is held to be tragic and to constitute a scandal, end quote. The social contract requires individuals to surrender spontaneity in order to gain protection from the intrusion of others. This notion of justice forces a compromise that subsumes the individual within the totality of the political system. Each individual becomes a unit whose spontaneity must be reconciled with that of all the other units in the total whole. Levinas points out that other people become, quote unquote, facts in such a system. Levinas argues that a perspective that sees other people as facts is insufficient as a grounds for an ethics of human relations. This perspective is characteristic of what Levinas means by totality. Totalizing systems take each person in them as a unit in a finite whole. The jurisdiction of a state, for example, extends to the finite totality of its citizens. In doing so, it views its subjects impersonally. Each subject has its own abstract human rights. Calls for justice based on the theoretical notion of human rights are very dominant today. Levinas, however, resists equating human rights with the ethical. Human moral relations, he insists, cannot be confined within a totality. The moral good of the eye-to-eye encounter with the other has an aspect of infinity. This association of the ethical with the infinite potential of unmediated human encounters preoccupies Levinas in Totality and Infinity and gives us a basis for a moral philosophy that can distinguish what it is about human beings that makes them capable of participating in an ethical milieu that technology, by definition, cannot access. Levinas insists that the moral conscience, awakened by the encounter with the other, emerges prior to any concept of political justice. The fundamental conscience is, for Levinas, prior to the awareness of the fact or truth of other people that forms the premise for totalizing systems. Levinas insists, quote, the other is not initially a fact, end quote. This moral conscience calls into question the doctrine of individual liberty by preserving the infinity of the other and arousing in the subject an awareness of her own insufficiency with respect to it. Throughout Totality and Infinity, Levinas uses the capital O other to signify the transcendence of this primal encounter face to face with another human being. This primal encounter welcomes the other. It is an encounter not dictated by a set of predetermined expectations based on facts or categories we have learned from experience. This is an open, unmediated encounter. It is an eye-to-eye encounter, a summons out of one's own inner consciousness, under the gaze of another human being who also has a boundless inner consciousness. This encounter exposes to me my own moral insufficiency. Rather than resulting in a cataloging of the other as another unit in the social contract, this encounter shakes my conscience at its foundations. For Levinas, this consciousness of moral unworthiness repudiates the doctrine of individual liberty as the first premise for ethical life. Levinas writes in the quote on the handout, the critique of spontaneity engendered by the consciousness of moral unworthiness precedes truth, precedes the consideration of the whole, and does not imply the sublimation of the I in the universal. The first consciousness of my immorality is not my subordination to facts, but to the other, to the infinite. The idea of totality and the idea of infinity differ precisely in that the first is purely theoretical, while the second is moral. Levinas finds in this encounter with the other a limitation on one's freedom. The other, with his or her own metabolic needs, capacity for discourse, and endless inner landscape, intrudes upon one's confidence in one's own freedom. The other calls my assumption of my freedom into question. Levinas writes, to welcome the other is to put in question my freedom, end quote. Freedom is restrained in the encounter with the other as the conscience is awakened to its own fears and shame. Levinas writes, this one's short, so it's not on the handout. The other calls into question the naive right of my powers. Morality begins when freedom, instead of being justified by itself, feels itself to be arbitrary and violent, end quote. Levinas's insistence on the moral primacy of the face-to-face human encounter illustrates how vehemently his philosophy stands its ground against the blurring of the distinction between human and artificial intelligence. Although the moral conscience is a kind of a priori for Levinas, he does not ground it in the capacity of the intelligence to work out how to solve a problem of moral action. Levinas's notion of the moral encounter is pre-intellectual. In this, Levinas differs from the a priori respect for other rational beings that Kant posited, and from the deliberation about action at the core of Aristotelian ethics. The Levinasian encounter is with another's full metabolic presence. The other is revealed to have hunger and thirst, along with desire, curiosity, and the capacity to use speech in infinite ways. Levinas is committed to retaining this very primal human-on-human encounter as the basis for morality. Levinas's moral philosophy is designed to withstand the potential for the great evils of totalitarianism, which attempt to dehumanize certain groups in order to treat them as things. Section 3, the threat of totalitarianism. Levinas's thought was, as I said, much informed by his experience as a Jewish POW in a German prison during World War II. His experience of his own incarceration and his reflections on the horrors of the concentration camps left Levinas eager to expose the patterns of thought that might enable such a systematic genocide. Jews were dehumanized and reduced. They were viewed as abject bodies, things to be moved around and destroyed. As Viktor Frankl describes his own experience in the camps in his volume, Man's Search for Meaning, quote, one literally became a number, dead or alive. That was unimportant. The life of a number was completely irrelevant, end quote. Within the camps, the ethical was forsaken as prisoners struggled for survival at all costs. Hannah Arendt explores the banality of evil that enabled the casual cruelty of concentration camp guards. Levinas became interested in exploring how totalizing systems become susceptible to the banal, in which humans are casually reduced to things and morality is abandoned. Levinas observes that any institutional or totalizing view of laws and operations hold within it the potential for immorality. Totalizing systems do not have safeguards for the breakdown that can emerge when people are dehumanized and vilified by the system itself. In locating the moral good in the infinite possibility of direct human relations, Levinas locates the moral center in primary face-to-face human encounters that elude the attempt of totalizing systems to manage them. Eye-to-eye contact, of course, does not always have an ethical aspect. We can look at other humans in all kinds of ways that do not summon us to any moral obligation. As we go about our business in the world, we can look at other people dispassionately. We can look at others while running an internal narrative, rife with assumptions, judgments, and rejections directed toward them. Often, our interactions with other people are merely transactional. For Levinas, the emergence of the full ethical relation requires the individual to come out of the interiority that enables these superficial relationships, to move from interior to exterior. Levinas subtitles Totality and Infinity, an essay on exteriority. Exteriority is a willingness to encounter another human being without pre-existing expectations or labels that stem from our own inner narratives. Exteriority welcomes others without classifying them or reducing them. For Levinas, the fundamental problem of Gaiji's ability to remain hidden is that it enables a human being to have an inner life without a corresponding summons to exteriority. Levinas asks, quote, "Does not Gaiji's position involve the impunity of a being alone in the world? That is, a being for whom the world is a spectacle?" End quote. Returning to the myth of Gaiji's, Levinas goes on, this is the third quote on the handout. Gaiji's ring symbolizes separation. Gaiji's plays a double game, a presence to the others and an absence, speaking to others and evading speech. Gaiji's is the very condition of man, the possibility of injustice and radical egoism, the possibility of accepting the rules of the game, but cheating. Our age offers unprecedented opportunities for isolation. Daily life requires multiple encounters with people within the rules of the totalizing economic system that governs our interactions. We interact with many people for whom we need not feel responsible. For the most part, the discourse we have with these people is limited to preset expectations about transactional matters. These human interactions are primarily understood in economic terms. In economic terms, human value is replaced by productive value. Levinas writes in the fourth quote on the handout, "The state which realizes its essence in work slips toward tyranny and thus attests my absence from those works which across the economic necessities return to me as alien. From the work I am only deduced and am already ill understood, betrayed rather than expressed." Levinas's phenomenological method exposes how the potential for immorality only emerges when an individual is drawn out of such interiority. The moral conscience is awakened by an exterior relationship with others as other human beings. The other, in the moral sense, is encountered as a particular individual without pre-classification. Levinas describes this encounter as a kind of epiphany that cuts past transitional language. This is quote number 5. When this primordial manifestation of the other has already taken place, when an existent has presented himself, not only verbal signs, but all signs can serve as language. That's an end quote for those that don't have the handout. This presencing of the other is an epiphany in the sense that it imposes an obligation on the beholder. The face-to-face encounter awakens the moral conscience to its own responsibilities in its community with others. To emerge from interiority to exteriority entails a radical vulnerability to others. Levinas writes in the 6th quote, "To return to exterior being, to being in the univocal sense, the sense that hides no other sense, is to enter into the straightforwardness of the face-to-face. This is not a play of mirrors, but my responsibility. That is, an existence already obligated. It places the center of gravitation of a being outside of that being. The surpassing of phenomenal or inward existence does not consist in receiving the recognition of the other, but in offering him one's being. To be in itself is to express oneself, that is, already to serve the other." For Levinas, we are already obligated by the face-to-face encounter. This is a different concept of obligation than that imposed from without, as from laws, duties, or customs. For Levinas, the relationship of obligation is an ontological condition, evoked by the very existence of the other. Our obligation to the other goes deeper than duties imposed or good deeds inspired by notions of charity. Only the face-to-face human encounter can evoke this primal relationship of obligation that Levinas lays as the ground for the moral relationship. Section 4, Interiority and Exteriority. In the interior approach intent upon securing one's own food and shelter, the individual does not yet accept her moral duty, her obligation to share of her possessions, to serve the other. The metabolism is something which situates the human within desire, the desire for food and shelter, the desire to procure and safeguard the material goods of life. In finding satisfaction for our desires, we can enjoy the world, and with our human consciousness, we can make choices about what and how to enjoy. Levinas identifies enjoyment and our choice about how and what we enjoy as a uniquely human characteristic, but he does not find in it a sound basis for moral life. As we procure our own food and furnishings to bring home, others go hungry, lack shelter. The encounter with the other awakens us to another infinity, the infinite bodily needs of other human beings. The encounter with the other is a summoning to this infinity. Levinas concludes that when we look upon the world with desire and appetite, the things of the world already present themselves to us as things which we could acquire. Levinas writes, quote, "The access to values, usage, manipulation, and manufacture rest on possession, on the hand that takes, that acquires, that brings back home." End quote. This world of things that present themselves as potential acquisitions cannot, for Levinas, be the ground for ethics. Levinas separates behavior with respect to human appetite and consumption from the true ground of the ethical. Levinas looks at human beings as fundamentally metabolic creatures who devour food and resources, excrete waste, and litter the world with the detritus of our consumption. This is our existential condition. Totalizing transactional systems arise precisely because we do not encounter the world with simple curiosity, but with an attitude of desire and acquisition so as to serve our metabolic needs. In encountering things as potential acquisitions, we establish a transactional relationship with them and with the others we may need to interact with in order to conduct our business. Transactional things enter the marketplace and we can take ownership of them. This is quote 7 now. Because it is not in itself, a thing can be exchanged and accordingly be compared, be quantified and consequently already lose its very identity, be reflected in money. Property alone institutes permanence in the pure quality of enjoyment, but this permanence disappears forthwith in the phenomenality reflected in money. As property, merchandise, bought and sold, a thing is revealed in the market as susceptible of belonging, being exchanged, and accordingly as convertible into money, susceptible of dispersing in the anonymity of money, end quote. Transactional encounters emerge for Levinas as the grounds for totalizing systems that organize human interactions around set policies, rules, and laws. Economic systems, mercantile systems, justice systems, political systems, all operate by establishing codes of conduct. In such interactions, human beings are expected to know the rules. The rules and policies dictate the types of interactions that are permissible within the transactional framework set up by the system. Instead of encountering others and being encountered by them as individuals, we interact with other humans according to set patterns. Levinas as a practice, sorry, I'm just going to skip something I'm not committed to. Hang on. Sorry. Levinas, as a practicing Jew who suffered incarceration in Germany during the Holocaust, had opportunity to give deep thought to how the union of body and soul might inform secular moral philosophy. Elsewhere, he describes his sense that the essence of Talmudic law does not obligate only the Jewish people, but is in fact an expression of the ontological moral condition that encompasses all people. And here's quote 8 from the handout. Quote, "All nations are bequeathed a difficult tradition of duties toward the other man, which one is never done with an order in which one is never free. In this order, above all else, duty takes the form of obligation toward the body, the obligation of feeding and sheltering, end quote. Levinas attempts to uncover the grounds for moral life that he finds already present in the phenomena of human interaction. By placing the encounter with the other at the root of moral life, Levinas feels that he is describing something about the awakening of conscience that arises in an unencumbered, undiluted meeting with a stranger. This awakening of conscience is for Levinas accompanied by wonder at the infinity represented by other human beings. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, Miranda, raised on a desert island with only her father as human company, marvels at her first encounter with strangers. "Oh, brave new world," she breathes, "that has such people in it." Miranda's encounter with the shipwrecked company is entirely without expectation. Levinas does not ask us to replicate Miranda's innocence, but to recognize the wonder that such an open encounter evokes. Perhaps, like Miranda, we feel uncomfortable when we open ourselves to the infinity of the other. This discomfort is the sign of a fundamental ethical bond between human beings. This bond cannot be abstracted. Its essence is in the face-to-face encounter. Its claim on us cannot be felt from a position of isolation. In prioritizing this encounter, Levinas reframes the principles of charity that ground many religions. In Levinas's moral philosophy, these principles are grounded in something fundamental about human encounters, something which doesn't require the command of a deity to be evoked. Levinas gives a moral foundation for an age in which many aspects of the sacred are on the wane. Levinas reminds us of the fundamental power of the face-to-face human encounter that calls not just for charity, but for curiosity and wonder about the experiences of the stranger. Homer, in his epic poem The Odyssey, captures the wonder and amazement with which the Greeks received the stranger, the xenos, in their homes. The Greeks had an ethic around the receiving of the stranger. In Book 3 of the Odyssey, Odysseus' son Telemachus arrives at Nestor's home in a quest for news about his father. Homer describes how Nestor's family receives Telemachus and his companion, despite having no way to recognize them. This is quote 9 on the handout. These men, when they sighted the strangers, all came down together and gave them greeting with their hands and offered them places. First, Pisistratos, son of Nestor, came close up to them and took them both by the hands and seated them at the feasting on soft rugs of fleece there on the sand of the seashore next to his brother Thrasymmedes, and next to his father. He gave them portions of the vitals and poured wine for them in a golden cup, end quote. Later, arriving at Menelaus' home on the same quest, a servant named Eteonius sees them coming and asks Menelaus if they should be greeted with hospitality. Menelaus replies in the 10th quote, "Eteonius, son of Boethos, you were never a fool before, but now you are babbling nonsense as a child would do. Surely we too have eaten much hospitality from other men before we came back here. Unharness the strangers' horses then, and bring the men here to be feasted." Levinas's presentation, and sorry, that's an end quote of the Odyssey quote. Levinas's presentation of the ethical encounter with the other focuses similarly on the opening of the home as an act of radical hospitality that offers oneself in service to the other. This hospitality requires a certain type of welcome that is important to Levinas, who writes, quote, "I welcome the other who presents himself in my home by opening my home to him," end quote. This welcoming has both a literal and a metaphoric meaning. I have to let the stranger inside. This inside could be the interior of my house, or it could be my own interior psychic and mental space. I have to receive another human being in all that they represent of the infinity of human being. Levinas asserts that ethical life requires that we liberate ourselves from the bond of interiority that home and possessions hold over us. Ethical life requires that we admit a stranger across the threshold of our interior space, or we go out of our door and encounter the other. The other calls me away from the things I possess and enjoy. This encounter with another human in this particular non-transactional way draws us out of the complacency of possession and compels us to this encounter with what Levinas calls the infinity of exteriority. This liberation will allow things to be viewed apart from the lens of acquisitiveness that accompanies our procurement of what we need to tend to ourselves. Levinas writes in the quote 11, In order that I be able to free myself from the very possession that the welcome of the home establishes, in order that I be able to see things in themselves, that is, represent them to myself, refuse both enjoyment and possession, I must know how to give what I possess. But for this, I must encounter the indiscrete face of the other that calls me into question. The other, the absolutely other, paralyzes possession, which he contests by the epiphany in the face. The other is indiscreet in the sense that the other presents, sorry, that was the end of the quote for those that don't have the handout. The other is indiscreet in the sense that the other presents as someone who has not located himself within the prescribed rules of the transactional. The awakening to the infinity of exteriority is for Levinas the moment that, quote, this voice coming from another shore teaches transcendence itself, end quote. It is a human-on-human encounter that does not have any of the limits of prior expectation. Levinas says, quote, limitation is produced only within a totality, whereas the relation with the other breaks the ceiling of the totality, end quote. This relation with the other cannot be reduced to pre-existing expectations about the other person's role or transactional function. This is a relationship in which the other person is encountered as a particular individual, free from any labels that one might use to designate their utility or to classify their identity. Section 5, language. Excuse me. In the moral world of infinity, Levinas asserts, language itself shifts away from the transactional language we use to go about the business of tending to our metabolic needs and our desires for acquisition. Language in this new sense acquires a deeper human ethical dimension. In the language possible in infinity, the interlocutor presents as someone I cannot place neatly into a preconceived category about his type. I receive this interlocutor prepared to listen as if for the first time, prepared to let myself be surprised, lost in wonder. Speaking of these preconceived categories, Levinas writes, quote, to be sure, most of the time, the who is a what. The answer presents itself as a quiddity. It refers to a system of relations, end quote. In the transactional language, when we ask who, we are expecting an answer about what. Levinas writes, quote, we ask, who is Mr. X? And we answer, he is the president of the state council, or he is Mr. So-and-so, end quote. When we receive a what answer to a who question, we assign the individual to a pre-existing category that we have built around the information we have about the system. Even our relations with the poor, the abject, and the stranger are subject to this totalizing effect. If I encounter a panhandler outside the supermarket, for example, I assign him or her to the category I have for those who approach me with this behavior. Who is he or she? He or she is a panhandler. I have assigned him or her to a type. I may give him money in the expected way, but I do not welcome him in the Levinasian ethical sense. On the contrary, I receive him with suspicion, even cynicism. There is almost no scenario in which I would ask this person to tell me about themselves, and almost no way for us to engage in dialogue at all. This is a relatively benign example of how totalizing systems subsume even the starving by replacing who questions with what. The answers come in the form of categories. Other people signal their categories to us through data points, such as language, clothing, hairstyle, etc. In the totalizing world, we can put people into their categories, often without ever having addressed them. Levinas's conception of an ethical language of infinity that would depart from these systematic norms is such that he has no room for data about the interlocutor. Data is information about what they are, not who they are. Levinas's insistence that there is a deeper use of language, the language of infinity, distinguishes it from this transactional type of listening. In the infinity of exteriority, Levinas claims, quote, the question who envisages a face, end quote. In Levinas's infinity, I look into the unique eyes of the other. I receive the other as someone whose speech I am ready to listen to as such. I am prepared to be surprised, to wonder. Most speech operates at the level of a signifier that conveys a sign, but Levinas does not think that signification is the whole truth about how humans use language. He points out that the essential being of the signifier is in no way disclosed by the act of signifying. Levinas writes, quote, the signifier, he who gives a sign, is not signified, end quote. In order for language to function at the basic level of signification, the speakers must already be in a posture to hear speech through its signifying function. Levinas writes, quote, "It is necessary to have already been in the society of signifiers for the sign to be able to appear as a sign," end quote. Levinas finds that this feature of the prior presentation of the signifier is overlooked. We move too quickly to hear the sign and overlook the transcendent quality of the signifier. To signify through language, the signifier must have already presented herself before the society of signifiers codified around this type of communication. This level of prior presentation holds for Levinas a deeper moral possibility for human encounters. How does the signifier present herself prior to being able to use language to communicate? The answer for Levinas is that he presents a face. Quote, "The signifier must present himself before every sign, by himself, present a face," end quote. The face has an unusual and profound place in Levinas's ethics. It is not always a literal in-person face, but it does need to be beheld as this presentation of a human being prior to the use of signifying language. The human opens to another human who cannot be reduced to quiddity. Levinas writes, quote, "The epiphany of the face qua face opens humanity," end quote. The human being eludes full containment by signification. Language cannot simply signify human being. Levinas's notion of the face-to-face beholding is where the opportunity for a genuine ethical relationship arises. The ethical can only arise if the conditions are achieved for what Levinas calls, quote, "the total transparency of the gaze directed upon the gaze, the absolute frankness of the face-to-face proffered at the bottom of all speech," end quote. The ethical subject has to emerge from the interiority of inner thoughts and expectations and enter into a relationship of authentic service to another. This is not service in the sense of charity. It is service in the sense that it attends to the being in itself of the other. This service recognizes that humans are equal in responsibility for one another. Levinas writes, and I don't think this is on the handout, quote, "Equality is produced where the other commands the same and reveals himself to the same in responsibility. Otherwise it is but an abstract idea and a word. It cannot be detached from the welcoming of the face, of which it is a moment," end quote. Levinas equates ethics with being in itself. Thus, quote, "To be in oneself is to express oneself, that is, already to serve the other. The ground of expression is goodness. To be in itself is to be good," end quote. Western philosophy has long been obsessed with the status of the thing in itself. Kant is famous for his assertion that we can never encounter it. Levinas asserts, by contrast, that there is a way to return to our univocal being, to our being in itself. But he does not see how this can happen as long as we restrict our being to the totalizing systems that use language merely to signify categories. The encounter with the other is an awakening to the potential for infinity within another human being. The transactional world is suspended. In the ethical mode, I gaze upon another human being with wonder and awe. I welcome their being and acknowledge its pre-existing claim. When I read Totality and Infinity with my students, they often ask, "What is Levinas telling me I should do?" We would all feel more comfortable if there was a simple answer to our question about our actual moral obligations. Levinas, however, is not prescriptive. He is a phenomenologist. His work is fundamentally descriptive. There is no formula. Levinas gives no advice. His call is to attend to an ethical condition that is intrinsic to our being, our ontology. Toward the end of Totality and Infinity, Levinas points out that totalizing systems are necessary. Governments, with their provisions for economic, legislative, and judicial systems, all need to function as pluralities. Pluralism is a necessary aspect of human communities. History would not be possible without it. Levinas does not deny this. He merely asks us to keep in mind that the source of morality in human life is not found in totalizing systems. The wellspring of the ethical is in these radical encounters in which humans encounter each other as beings whose expression invokes infinity. Levinas's earlier writings established his commitment to the ethical as service to the others in the form of a responsibility to and for others. In the Talmud lectures, Levinas states, quote, "The epiphany of the other person is ipso facto my responsibility toward him. Seeing the other is already an obligation toward him. A direct optics, without the mediation of any idea, can only be accomplished as ethics," end quote. And later, quote, To hear a voice speaking to you is ipso facto to accept obligation toward the one speaking, end quote. The moral encounter that obligates me occurs prior to my locating the terms I might later use to signify the other. Levinas writes, quote, "The obligations to the service of all do not result from individual obligations and rights, but are prior to them," end quote. In Totality and Infinity, Levinas continues his exploration of the epiphany of beholding another human being as such, and accepting that his or her humanity, and I'm not trying to dismiss other pronouns, it's just hard to work everything in, accepting that his or her humanity holds an imperative of responsibility over me. Only in this beholding can we find a moral standard that might have a chance of maintaining our humanity in the midst of the horrors of a genocide, a holocaust, a mass famine, or a deadly pandemic. For Levinas, the epiphany in the encounter with the other requires discourse. Speech between humans is a fundamental expression. Levinas calls this fundamental speech an incomparable manifestation that extends beyond the utilitarian mechanism in which signs are signified. Levinas points out that in attending to discourse with others, there is a surplus that goes beyond mere signification. He writes in the 12th quote, "Speech is an incomparable manifestation. It unlocks what every sign closes up, by making the signifier attend this manifestation of the signified. This attendance measures the surplus of spoken language over written language, which has again become signs. Signs are a mute language, a language impeded." End quote. Language as sign is transactional. A sign is given, the looked-for response is signaled. Levinas finds transactional language necessary for totalizing systems, but it is not the fullest, most ethical form of human language. Levinas describes humans' most primary speech, the speech that enables the ethical encounter. And this is in quote 13. When this primordial manifestation of the other has already taken place, when an existent has presented himself and come to the assistance of himself, not only verbal signs, but all signs can serve as language. The language by which a being exists for another is his unique possibility to exist with an existence that is more than his interior existence. The surplus that language involves, with respect to all the works and labors that manifest a man, measures the distance between the living man and the dead, who is alone recognized by history, which approaches him objectively in his work or his heritage. History, as it memorializes humans, has to sum them up, assign them labels that reflect their roles, their contributions to other totalizing systems. Ethical speech is the surplus, that is, what is left over after all the labels and tallies are used to assess and assign a person's place in history. This surplus is the discourse that encounters another as other and enables the recognition of the other as a particular being for whom I bear responsibility. It is in this primary encounter with the exterior human world that I am summoned to the obligation of service to others who have the same needs for food, clothing, and shelter as myself, and also the same capacity for the surplus of speech that can signify their unique particularity. Levinas puts great emphasis on the moral value in allowing ourselves to be open and prepared to be surprised by others' discourse. This openness is at the heart of what we do here at St. John's. We ask students and faculty alike to go into the classroom prepared to listen receptively, even to comments that we ourselves may have excluded in our private reading of the text. We move around campus, engaging in spontaneous discourse with those we encounter. Our approach to language has the unfettered quality of curiosity that Levinas asks us to cultivate. Granted, we have the texts as the foundation for our discourse, but we also encounter each other as a kind of other, prepared to be surprised by each other's ideas. Conclusion. Levinas is unique for locating the ethical in these encounters of infinity. In the transactional world of totalizing systems, a lot of good can be done. A judicial system can dispense justice. Legislation and economics can provide the basis for the flourishing of all. History can keep records of human deeds and enable memory of the past. These systems can and should be held accountable, but they are not for Levinas the grounds for ethical life. In Levinas's philosophy, the individual in isolation has no grounds for morality. The fundamental human practices of securing food, shelter, and clothing are inward-looking and self-oriented. While Levinas sees the commonplace paradigm of securing the home as necessary and important, this is not where the moral conscience awakens. The moral conscience awakens when one crosses the literal and metaphorical thresholds that protect and buffer one's interiority. The movement from interiority to exteriority invokes a fundamental human conscience that finds itself shaken and moved by the presence of the capital O, other. Exteriority is a willingness to encounter other human beings as such, prior to our assignment of them to the types of categories that regulate totalities. Exteriority requires that we be attentive to how quickly we assign our encounters with others to these types and categories. Although we move toward these assignments rapidly, habitually, perhaps even subconsciously, they are not inevitable. There is a space in which we can linger over the other person's infinity. We can recognize that language and discourse require a prior condition of openness to the interlocutor that remains undefined prior to the conversation. Moral virtue, whether held to through philosophical convictions or to faith, requires courage. Aristotle gives a privileged place to the virtue of courage in Nicomachean Ethics. Kant acknowledges that adhering to the categorical imperative might put one in physical danger, even in danger of one's life. Levinas's philosophy also requires great courage. In this case, it is the courage to open oneself fully to the other according to the terms of the ethics of infinity. Ethics begins when we invite the stranger across our symbolic threshold or step outside it ourselves. The domain of the ethical has to extend past the reflex of self-preservation. In today's age, much of the personal business can be conducted without the need for encounters with others. The recent New York Times article on the TechFast project here at St. John's exposed the get the app culture in which we are pressured to do our business remotely with the app. Corporations want us to use their app, and they sell it to us with the lure of convenience. Get the app culture functions as a kind of ring of gyges. With the app, you can conduct your business without needing even a transactional encounter. The isolation and autonomy possible in our age erodes collective moral life. We can conduct personal business and look out at the world as spectators, as gyges could, while remaining safely within our interiority. Levinas died in 1996, before the rise of the kinds of digital technologies we have today. He was more concerned with the extremities of human suffering he witnessed during the Holocaust. Imagine yourself a prisoner in Auschwitz, starving. This is the ultimate moral thought experiment. In meeting the gaze of your fellow prisoner, could you find yourself fully present to him? Would you break your bread in half to share with her? These are extreme questions, but Levinas feels strongly that we need an ethics that would survive such extremis. There was no justice in the concentration camps, no policies or legislation to protect the starving. The totalizing system was organized around killing as many people as possible. 2 more paragraphs. Levinas's philosophy goes further. Attempts to reframe our inclination towards self-preservation to include an attentiveness to the humanity of others, even in the most extreme crises. Levinas's focus is on looking into the eyes of the other, bearing witness to the shared obligations of our humanity. Levinas asks us to attend to the language that spills over as surplus, to the need to convey utilitarian signs. Such a surplus might include a moment of shared empathy, conveyed through the eye-to-eye encounter. Levinas's ethics might provide some salvific humanitarian impulse, even in the most extreme situations of suffering. Last paragraph. Perhaps someday the human race will eliminate war and genocide. Perhaps the great gap between the privileged rich and the suffering poor will someday diminish. Will someday ever come? Our times are imperiled not just by age-old evils, but also by unique moral hazards due to the effects of radical new technologies. Yet the ethical imperative remains. I will close with a reference to another mythological ring of invisibility, the Ring of Sauron, that Frodo and Sam set out to destroy in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In response to Frodo lamenting that he was born into the age in which the ring reappears, Gandalf says, "That is not for us to decide. All there is for us to decide is what to do with the time we are given. Thank you for your attention today.